Welcome to a deep dive, into one of the most chilling events
Mhm.
in modern history, the Jonestown Massacre.
Yeah.
We're using a People magazine article.
Okay.
What happened during the Jonestown Massacre? The true story of the deadly mass murder in 1978, to
Wow.
try and understand how
Wow.
over 900 people ended up dead in a remote Guyanese settlement
Right.
on November 18, 1978.
Mhm.
And to help us navigate this incredibly complex and disturbing
Yeah.
story, we have an expert in cult dynamics.
Thank you.
I'm really hoping you can help us understand not just the what, but the why of Jonestown.
It's interesting, we often talk about Jonestown as this isolated incident,
Hmm.
but the more you look at the social and political landscape of the 70s,
Yeah.
the more you see it as a product of its time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. The Vietnam War, Watergate's civil rights struggles.
Right.
There was this widespread sense of disillusionment, of distrust in authority.
Mm.
People were craving something to believe in, a sense of community.
And Jones offered them that,
Exactly.
at least initially. The article talks about his early days preaching racial equality in the 50s and 60s that resonated with a lot of people, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Jones was a master at tapping into the anxieties of the time.
Mm-hmm.
He positioned himself as a savior,
Okay.
someone who understood the struggles of the marginalized
Yeah.
and offered a radical vision of a better world.
But then things took a dark turn.
Right.
He declared himself a prophet, claimed psychic powers, and accusations of abuse started surfacing.
Oh, wow.
Is this typical of cult leaders?
It's a classic escalation of control.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like the Milgram experiment,
Okay.
where ordinary people were willing to inflict pain on others just because an authority figure told them to.
Wow.
Jones started small, building trust, then gradually increased the demands at the commitment.
The article also mentions some pretty disturbing details about his personal life, like fathering a child with a member of his congregation. It seems like there was a huge disconnect between his public persona and his private actions.
That hypocrisy is another hallmark of cult leaders.
Yeah.
They often create a system where they are above the rules they impose on others.
Interesting.
It's a way of reinforcing their power and undermining any potential dissent.
So we have this charismatic, increasingly controlling figure in Jim Jones.
Right.
But what about the people who followed him?
Yeah.
The People's Temple itself started as a genuinely positive force.
Mm-hmm.
Promoting social justice and racial integration, did it?
It did, and that's what makes Jonestown so tragic.
Yeah.
Many of these people were drawn to Jones because of his message of equality and community.
Right.
They genuinely believed they were building a better world.
But then you have things like the white knights and loyalty tests that the article describes.
Mm-hmm.
How did these fit into Jones's strategy of control?
Those were key tools in breaking down individual resistance and creating a climate of fear.
Okay.
The White Knights, these all-night meetings,
Yeah.
where Jones would rant about enemies and impending doom.
Right.
They induced a state of constant anxiety, sleep deprivation.
Wow.
People were literally exhausted into submission.
And the loyalty tests. The article mentions Jones pretending to poison the congregation.
Oh, God.
I can't even imagine the psychological impact of that.
It was a brilliant, albeit horrific, tactic.
Mm-hmm.
By staging these fake crises,
Yeah.
Jones forced his followers to confront their own mortality,
Wow.
to choose between their own survival and their loyalty to him.
Right.
And in that moment of terror, many chose loyalty.
It seems like he was playing on some very primal human instincts. Fear, the need for belonging, the desire for security.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Jones understood that by manipulating those needs, he could control people's behavior.
Yeah.
He created a reality where the outside world was the enemy,
Hmm.
and he was the only one who could protect them.
So the People's Temple transforms from this community-focused organization
Right.
into something much darker.
Yeah.
And then comes the move to Jonestown itself. This isolated settlement in the Guyana jungle.
Right.
Was this always part of the plan, do you think?
I think it was the inevitable endpoint of Jones's escalating paranoia.
Okay.
He needed a place where he could exert total control,
Right.
where there was no escape, no outside influence.
Yeah.
And Jonestown tragically provided that.
The article describes Jonestown as this utopian experiment,
Mm-hmm.
but it clearly devolved into something much more sinister.
What's fascinating is how Jones manipulated the language of utopia to mask his authoritarianism.
Wow.
He promised his followers a paradise, but it came at a steep price.
Yeah.
Absolute obedience and the surrender of their individuality.
And it's important to note that not everyone was completely on board with this.
Right.
The article mentions growing dissent within Jonestown.
Yeah.
People who were starting to question Jones's authority.
Yes. And that dissent is what ultimately led to the tragedy.
Mm.
As Jones's grip on power started to slip, his paranoia intensified.
Mm-hmm.
And when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse,
Right.
it triggered a chain of events that culminated in the massacre.
So Ryan's visit was almost like a catalyst for the final act. What
Yeah.
happened when he got there?
Jones saw Ryan's visit as a direct threat to his authority.
Oh,
He was already incredibly paranoid,
yeah.
and this only fueled his fears.
Right.
As Ryan and his delegation prepared to leave with a group of defectors,
Mm-hmm.
Jones's security guards opened fire.
Which resulted in the deaths of Ryan, 3 journalists,
Yes,
and one of the defectors trying to leave a truly horrific turn of events.
absolutely. And back at the compound, Jones, realizing his grip on power was gone, orchestrated the mass suicide.
Wow.
It was a desperate act of control, a final, tragic manifestation of his warped worldview.
He convinced his followers that the outside world would torture and kill them.
Right.
That death was the only escape.
Yeah.
The image of all those people, including hundreds of children, drinking the cyanide-laced Flavor Aid, it's just devastating.
And it's important to remember the psychological context here. These people had been subjected to years of manipulation, fear-mongering, and isolation.
Right.
Their reality had been completely distorted.
Oh.
In that moment, many of them truly believed that death was the only option.
It's hard to fathom the level of fear and desperation that must have been present in those final moments.
It's a stark reminder of the power of cult leaders
Yeah.
and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority.
Mm-hmm.
And as we'll discuss further,
Yeah.
it raises important questions about the factors that make people susceptible to such manipulation
Right.
and what we can do to prevent future tragedies like this.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's hard to grasp the sheer scale of the loss at Jonestown. Over 900 people dead,
Yeah.
including hundreds of children.
Right.
The People article talks about the memorial
Yeah.
in Oakland, California, dedicated to the victims.
Right.
It's a haunting reminder of the human cost of this tragedy.
It must be incredibly difficult for survivors and family members
Absolutely.
to even try to process something like this.
Yeah.
The article mentions a debate about whether Jim Jones's name should be on the memorial. Some survivors feel strongly that he doesn't deserve to be remembered alongside his victims.
It's a complex issue, with no easy answers.
Yeah.
On the one hand, Jones orchestrated this horror. He manipulated and abused his followers,
Right.
ultimately leading them to their deaths.
Mm.
But he was also a product of his time, a deeply flawed individual consumed by his own delusions.
Right.
It raises tough questions about accountability and how we as a society
Yeah.
deal with the legacy of such horrific events.
It's their trauma, their loss.
Yeah,
I can understand why some would feel so strongly about excluding him from the memorial.
absolutely. It's vital that we listen to and respect those voices.
Right.
There's no single right way to heal or find closure after something like this.
Speaking of healing, the article highlights the resilience of some survivors.
Right.
It's remarkable how they've managed to rebuild their lives after such a traumatic experience.
Their stories are so important,
Yeah.
not just for understanding the inner workings of Jonestown,
Mm-hmm.
but also for learning how people cope with extreme trauma and manipulation.
Right.
One survivor recounted how Jones would fabricate news events,
Oh.
making the outside world seem even more dangerous than it was.
That's a tactic straight out of the authoritarian playbook. Control the information, control the narrative.
Precisely. Jones created this echo chamber where his voice was the only one his followers can trust.
Wow.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily our perceptions can be manipulated,
Right.
especially when we're isolated and fearful.
Another survivor mentioned how Jones would pit family members against each other.
Oh, wow.
Eroding those vital support systems is just so insidious.
It was a deliberate strategy to break down any potential resistance.
Hmm.
Jones understood that strong family bonds could threaten his absolute authority.
Right.
So he actively worked to sever those ties.
Wow.
The classic divide and conquer tactic.
It makes you wonder about the long-term psychological effects on those who lived through this, even those who escaped.
The scars of Jonestown run deep.
Yeah.
Many survivors still grapple with PTSD, the guilt of surviving when so many others didn't,
Right.
and the ongoing struggle to make sense of what they experienced.
Wow.
Their stories remind us that the impact of this tragedy goes far beyond that single day in 1978.
It's a sobering thought. What lessons can we learn from Jonestown to help prevent something like this from happening again?
Right.
The article mentions the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, which has become synonymous with blindly following a dangerous ideology.
That phrase, while somewhat problematic in its origin,
Right.
highlights the dangers of unchecked authority and groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
Jonestown wasn't just about one charismatic leader. It was about the failure of critical thinking on a mass scale.
So it's about recognizing the signs of manipulation, not just in cults,
Yeah.
but in any context where someone is trying to exert undue influence.
Exactly, whether it's a religious group, a political movement, or even a workplace.
Right.
We need to be wary of anyone who tries to isolate us, control information,
Mm.
or demand unquestioning loyalty. It's about trusting our instincts,
Yeah.
asking questions, and being willing to challenge authority.
It seems like education is key.
Absolutely.
The more we understand about cult dynamics and the psychology of manipulation, the better equipped we are to resist those forces.
We need to teach critical thinking skills from a young age.
Right.
Encourage open dialogue and debate, and foster a culture where people feel safe to question the status quo.
That's a powerful message. It's about empowering individuals to think for themselves,
Yeah,
to be discerning consumers of information,
right.
and to recognize the warning signs of manipulation before it's too late.
It's also important to remember that the people who followed Jones were not stupid or naive.
Right.
They were looking for meaning, purpose, and community.
Yeah.
And Jones exploited those needs, offering them a seductive vision of a better world.
It's a reminder that anyone can be vulnerable to these tactics,
Right.
especially in times of uncertainty or crisis.
Exactly. It's not about judging the victims, but understanding the complex factors that make people susceptible to manipulation.
It's about fostering a sense of empathy, recognizing that we all have vulnerabilities that can be exploited,
Yeah.
and creating a society where critical thinking and open dialogue are valued and celebrated.
It's a powerful vision, one that honors the memory of those lost at Jonestown and empowers us to create a future where such tragedies are never repeated.
Right.
But how do we actually apply these lessons to our own lives?
Yeah.
What can we do as individuals to cultivate that critical thinking and resist manipulation?
Right.
We'll explore that in more detail when we return.
We've been talking about, the horrors of Jonestown, the societal and psychological factors
Right.
that led to the tragedy and the enduring impact on survivors.
Mhm.
But now I want to get practical. How do we take these lessons
Right.
and apply them to our own lives? How do we become more discerning,
Yeah.
more resistant to manipulation, and less likely to drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak?
That's a great question, and it's something we should all be thinking about. What's fascinating here is that Jonestown isn't just a historical anomaly.
Right.
It reflects a timeless human struggle between our desire for belonging and our need for individual autonomy. And those same dynamics that led to that tragedy are still at play in our world today, maybe in more subtle ways.
So it's not just about avoiding cults, but about recognizing those manipulative patterns
Right.
in everyday life.
Exactly. Think about how easily misinformation spreads online, how quickly conspiracy theories take root,
Yeah.
or even in our personal relationships, how we can sometimes be drawn to people who offer easy answers or make us feel special,
Right.
even if their motives aren't entirely pure.
It's like we have this inherent need to believe, to find meaning and purpose, even if it means sacrificing some of our critical thinking skills.
And that's where the real work begins.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating a healthy skepticism,
Okay.
a willingness to question information, especially when it confirms our existing beliefs.
So how do we do that? Where do we start?
One key is diversifying our information sources.
Okay.
Don't just rely on one news outlet, one website, or one social media feed. Expose yourself to a variety of perspectives, even those you might initially disagree with.
That's harder than it sounds, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information tailored to our specific interests.
It is, but it's crucial. It's about breaking out of our echo chambers, challenging our own biases,
Yeah.
and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
It's almost like we need to cultivate a sense of intellectual humility,
Right.
acknowledging that we don't have all the answers
Yeah.
and that learning is an ongoing process.
Exactly, and that includes being willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence, even if it means admitting we were wrong.
It also seems important to be aware of our own emotional vulnerabilities.
Absolutely.
Jones preyed on people's fears and insecurities, offering them a sense of belonging and security in exchange for their loyalty.
It's about understanding how our emotions can be manipulated and developing strategies for managing those vulnerabilities.
Okay.
That might involve building strong support networks outside of any one group or ideology, practicing mindfulness and self-reflection, or seeking professional help when needed.
So it's not just about being intellectually discerning, but also emotionally resilient?
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
about developing a strong sense of self, knowing our own values,
Hmm.
and being able to withstand pressure from others, even those we might admire or respect.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this topic, but we've covered a lot of ground.
Right.
Any final thoughts for our listener before we wrap up?
Jonestown was a horrific tragedy, but it also offers us a profound opportunity for learning and growth.
Mm-hmm.
By studying the events that led to that tragedy, by understanding the psychological and social factors that made people vulnerable to manipulation,
Right.
and by cultivating our own critical thinking skills, we can honor the memory of those who are lost and work to create a world where such tragedies are never repeated.
It's a powerful message, and one that resonates deeply, especially in our current climate.
Yeah.
It's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be more discerning, more
Mm,
compassionate, and more courageous in our pursuit of truth and understanding.
absolutely.
To our listener, thank you for joining us on this difficult but essential deep dive.
Yeah, with pleasure.
We encourage you to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the memory of Jonestown alive
Hmm.
as a reminder of the importance of critical thinking and individual autonomy. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.